The hill of Kephala rises only a few meters above the surrounding terrain of north-central Crete, a low and unassuming landform that from a distance reads as a slight thickening of the plain rather than a hill in the conventional sense, and yet from its summit the full extent of the landscape that would sustain the palace through the middle centuries of the second millennium before the Common Era was legible in every direction. To the north, the sea, the Aegean coast visible as a pale line 5 kilometers away, the water catching the early morning light in the calm months, the white line of surf discernible on days when the northerly Meltemi was running. To the east and south, the red agricultural plain of the Kairos River Valley, planted in olive groves and grapevines that reached to the lower slopes of the limestone uplands where the springs that fed the river emerged from the rock. To the west, the gentler terrain of the island's interior, where grain grew in the broader alluvial soils below the calcareous hills, and where the routes from the southern coast of Crete converged before climbing the low pass toward the north. The island of Crete, long and narrow, running east to west for some 260 kilometers and never more than 60 kilometers wide, occupied a geographic position in the middle of the eastern Mediterranean that gave its inhabitants access to the sea lanes connecting Egypt, Cyprus, the Levant, and the Greek mainland without the necessity of long and difficult overland journeys. Egypt lay to the south across a sea passage of 2 or 3 days in a capable sailing vessel. Cyprus, with its copper ore deposits, lay to the northeast, and the Aegean Islands and the Greek mainland lay to the north and northwest, across a sea navigable in summer with reasonable confidence. The hill of Kephala, 5 kilometers inland from the north coast, was not itself a port, but its connection to the shore via the Kairos Valley was direct enough that goods arriving at the harbor could reach the palace storerooms within a day's movement, and the sea itself remained visible from the upper stories of the west wing on clear days, a reminder of the exchange network that sustained the economy of the site. The Kairos River, fed by springs from the limestone uplands to the south, ran along the eastern base of the hill, its water reliable through most of the year, diminishing in summer but not failing entirely in the years of normal rainfall, and the settlement that accumulated on the hill above it had access to this water source from its earliest phases. Neolithic deposits beneath the Bronze Age levels at Knossos reach back to the 7th millennium before the Common Era, making the site one of the most continuously occupied locations in the Aegean world. The Bronze Age palace built not on empty ground, but on the accumulated depth of millennia of habitation, each phase of occupation adding to the depth of the deposit and providing the leveled platform on which the later complex was laid out. The soil of the plain around Kephala was the deep red terra rossa characteristic of calcareous limestone terrain, a clay loam that retained moisture well through the dry Cretan summers, and that supported the olive and the vine, and in the broader valley floor, the emmer wheat and hulled barley that formed the dietary base of the population. Olive trees covered the lower slopes of the hill and the flat land between the site and the coast, their silver-green canopies persistent through the seasons, dropping their fruit in autumn and early winter into the nets spread below them. Grapevines grew in bush form on the drier slopes east of the Kairos, their roots reaching deep into the clay subsoil where some moisture persisted through the rainless summer months. The agricultural plain visible from Kephala was not wild terrain that had been cleared for a palace. It was cultivated land whose management predated the palace by centuries, whose fertility had drawn settlement to this particular hill long before the administrative complex that would make Knossos the most complex built structure in the Bronze Age, Aegean, was conceived and begun. The palace complex reached its most elaborate form in the centuries following 1700 before the Common Era, rebuilt on the foundations of an earlier structure that had itself replaced still earlier phases of construction, so that the new palace excavated by Arthur Evans at the beginning of the 20th century of the Common Era was the latest in a sequence of overlapping plans that had maintained the central court as their organizing axis through multiple rebuildings. The central court itself was a long rectangular space of packed limestone and gypsum slab paving, 27 meters wide and 55 meters in its north-south dimension. Its long axis aligned with the long axis of the hill and oriented so that the west wing, the most formally organized part of the complex, faced it from the left as one approached from the south. The court received no permanent structure within it. It remained open to the sky across its full extent, its floor surface worn smooth by the passage of feet across many decades of continuous use. The light it admitted to the surrounding wings, the primary natural illumination of the deeply interior rooms behind the court facades. The west wing to the west of the court held the storage magazines and the most formal ceremonial spaces, in a plan divided longitudinally by a long corridor running north to south, the storage rooms opening from the corridor to the west, and the ceremonial and administrative spaces arranged between the corridor and the court to the east. 18 storage magazines, long and narrow, parallel rooms with stone-flagged floors, held the bulk commodities of the palace economy. The pithoi, large clay storage jars, were placed in rows within the magazines, some of the larger vessels standing 1.5 meters above the floor level, their shoulders at eye height when a person stood beside them, their interiors holding olive oil or grain or other agricultural produce. In addition to the pithoi, rectangular stone-lined cists were cut into the floors of several magazines, their contents no longer present, but their construction indicating that the west wing served as a treasury as well as a commodity store. Light wells penetrated the multi-story interior at intervals, narrow shafts opened to the sky that brought daylight and moving air deep into rooms that would otherwise have had no natural light. The walls of the light wells were plastered smooth and sometimes painted, and the rooms that opened onto them received a diffuse, relatively even illumination suited to fine work and to the reading of documents and tallies. Broad timber-framed stairways, several of them surviving in section as stone treads and carbonized post stubs in the excavated deposits, connected the stories of the palace and allowed the upper floors, where the frescoed halls and the principal reception rooms were located, to be reached from the central court level and from the lower terraces of the eastern slope. The grand staircase on the east side of the court descended 4 stories into the hillside, the flights turning around a central light well, the treads of gypsum laid wide and low, so that the descent was gradual rather than steep, the proportions suggesting that the staircase was designed for people who moved in formal procession rather than for rapid transit. The overall plan of the palace, spread across approximately 22,000 square meters at its greatest extent, was not a simple symmetrical arrangement, but a layered and accretive one, each wing and each corridor representing a stage of elaboration added to an earlier form, the resulting building coherent in its central court axis and its division of storage from ceremony, but complex in the detail of its interconnections, its passages and stairways and light wells, creating a building that rewarded familiarity and that must have been navigated largely by habit among those who worked and lived within it. Beyond the palace proper, the settlement of Knossos extended across the hillsides and valley floor in a town whose full extent has been estimated at several square kilometers, its population at the peak of the New Palace period numbered in the tens of thousands, making the site the largest urban center in the Bronze Age Aegean and one of the most populous places in the Mediterranean world of the second millennium before the Common Era. The Royal Road, the best known of the paved routes that connected the palace to the surrounding settlement, ran northwest from the northwest corner of the palace through a neighborhood of substantial multi-room houses, its surface of flat limestone slabs, still traceable in sections today, along the path Evans identified and partially cleared in the early 20th century. The road had a raised central walkway flanked by lower side paths, a construction suggesting that the central portion was reserved for particular categories of traffic, whether pedestrians moving in formal procession or officials whose status entitled them to the prepared surface, while pack animals and workers carrying loads used the lower flanking paths that kept them clear of the primary passage. The houses along the Royal Road were not simple agricultural dwellings, but structures of several rooms around interior courtyards, their walls plastered and in some cases painted with fresco decoration in the same tradition as the palace itself. Their household assemblages, including the fine painted pottery and the administrative seal impressions that indicate these were households connected in some formal way to the palace economy, their inhabitants part of the network of dependents and specialists that the palace administration organized and supplied. The caravanserai, a building identified by Evans south of the palace, at the point where several routes from the upland interior converged on the site, preserved a fresco of partridges and hoopoes on its interior walls, the birds painted with the careful naturalistic attention that characterizes the best Minoan wall painting, their forms moving across a schematic landscape of rocky outcrops that evoked the limestone terrain above the valley, and the building had a large stone footbath, a basin wide enough for a person to stand in, fed by a channel in the threshold stone, offering travelers arriving from the upland roads a place to wash before entering the palace precinct. A viaduct of dressed stone carried the Royal Road across a shallow valley on a series of supported arches, one of the earliest viaduct constructions surviving in the Aegean world, its engineering demonstrating the same attention to drainage management and durability that the palace drainage system showed in the building's own pipe runs. The willingness to invest in permanent stone infrastructure for road surfaces and road crossings, indicating that the connections between the palace and the surrounding settlement were maintained and managed as seriously as the interior corridors and storerooms of the palace itself. The town that surrounded the palace was not a passive recipient of the palace's administration, but an active component of the productive system. The craft workshops, producing faience and stone vessels and worked textiles, the households keeping the records of local transactions, the families who sent sons and daughters into palace service, were distributed through the settlement in the same way that administrative functions were distributed through the wings of the palace, the urban fabric and the palatial fabric forming a single integrated economic and social structure rather than a royal enclave surrounded by a dependent population. Administrative work at Knossos occupied the early part of the day, when light came in through the east-facing light wells and the morning air was still cool enough for sustained concentration in the rooms adjacent to the long west corridor. The scribes sat in small chambers with low benches and worked in clay, pressing a stylus with a flat rectangular end into tablets that had been formed by hand into the standard Minoan palm-sized shape, a rounded rectangle, flat on one face and slightly convex on the reverse. The clay mixed to a consistency that accepted the stylus without tearing, and that dried slowly enough to allow correction by smoothing before the tablet was finished. The signs inscribed on the tablets were the syllabic characters of Linear A, a script that remains undeciphered, combined with logograms, small pictographic signs for the commodities being counted, a seated female figure for a category of female personnel, an olive spray for oil, a stylized sheep's head for wool, a vessel form for wine. Each tablet was a single transaction or a running tally, not a narrative record of events, and not a text intended to be read by anyone but the administrator who inscribed it and the supervisor who checked it, the record existing to support the redistribution system and to provide an audit trail that could be checked against physical stores. The tablets recorded the flows of goods into and out of the palace storerooms in detail, that read across multiple tablet sets from a single administrative period reveals the scope and geographic reach of the palace economy. Sheep were counted by the thousand in some records, the animals distributed across the agricultural hinterland of the Knossos plain and the upland pastures above it, assessed for their expected wool yield per animal. The wool allocated to weaving workshops, whose output was itself tracked as finished textiles measured in units of weight or length. Oil allocations to named workers and to named functional categories appeared in other sets, the volumes specified and the recipients identified by name or by personnel category. The tablets forming a network of cross-references that allowed the administration to track the movement of a commodity from the olive press in the agricultural hinterland through the storage magazine and into the hands of the palace worker who received it as a ration or a payment. Craft production in the northeastern quarter of the palace occupied workers alongside the scribal operation, the floor deposits of the excavated workshops holding concentrations of unfinished objects and production debris. Stone vessel production began with the rough shaping of a block of limestone or imported alabaster, then the hollowing of the interior using a tubular bronze drill loaded with abrasive sand. The drill rotated while the block was held fixed. The interior removed in a spiral of material that was discarded as dust and fragments. The finished vessels appeared in palatial contexts across Crete and in high-status deposits on the Greek mainland, their role as prestige objects circulating through exchange networks distinguishing them from common household storage vessels. The morning work of the administrative complex was not only textual and craft-based, but also involved the movement of goods through the storerooms, the checking of seals on deliveries, the opening and closing of the stone-floored magazines, the physical handling of the pithoi, and the cysts that formed the material archive of the palace's accumulated wealth, so that the building in the morning hours was a place of concurrent and overlapping activity. The scribes working alongside the storage administrators, working alongside the craft workers, the corridors carrying a continuous traffic of people and goods that was the economic metabolism of the most complex institution in the Bronze Age Aegean. The storage capacity of the West Wing magazines represented not merely a reserve for the palace population, but the physical infrastructure of a regional redistribution economy whose scale was unusual for the second millennium before the Common Era. The large pithoi in the 18 magazines, taking the volume of the surviving vessels as the basis for calculation, held between 800 and 1,000 liters each. And the rows of vessels in each magazine, combined with the additional capacity of the floor cysts, brought the aggregate storage potential of the West Wing alone to an estimated several 100,000 liters of olive oil, a quantity that exceeded the annual consumption needs of the palace population by a very considerable margin, and that could only have been accumulated and maintained in the context of a regional collection and redistribution system. Olive oil was the primary commodity of this system, its long storage life and high caloric density making it the ideal reserve commodity for a palace economy that needed to sustain a dependent workforce through lean years as well as good ones. And the oil moved through the system in both directions, arriving in the magazines as collected tribute and assessment from the agricultural estates of the Knossos plain, and leaving the magazines as rations, as payments to craft workers and palace personnel. and as a traded export moving through the maritime exchange network to Egypt and the Aegean Islands. Wool was the other great managed commodity. Its movement through the palace economy, documented in more detail than any other product by the Linear A and Linear B tablet records. Thousands of sheep tracked across tablet sets that recorded the location of each group, the name of the shepherd responsible, and the expected annual yield per animal. The collected wool weighed and allocated to groups of weavers, distributed both within the palace precinct and across the agricultural hinterland. The finished textiles, a principal export of the Minoan economy, in the same maritime system that brought copper ingots and prestige goods back to the island. Faience working occupied a different workshop tradition. The material itself a powdered quartz body mixed with copper or tin oxides to produce the characteristic blue-green surface color, formed by hand or in open molds into beads, plaques, and small figurines, and then fired at low temperature in a kiln that the palace workshops maintained for this purpose and for the production of glazed pottery. Minoan faience objects have been found at Egyptian sites and at sites on the Greek mainland, and Egyptian faience reached Crete in the same exchange system, the material moving in both directions as a recognizable and valued craft product. Seal carving was the most technically demanding of the palace crafts. The stones worked, carnelian and agate and amethyst and serpentine from sources both local and imported, shaped into convex lentoid or almond forms, and then engraved on the flat face with miniature scenes whose complexity and dynamic quality are fully legible only under magnification. The scenes on Minoan seals showed humans and animals in motion, composite creatures, sacred symbols, and formal arrangements of figures that recur across many examples, indicating a shared visual vocabulary that the seal carvers learned and worked within, rather than invented freshly for each commission. Each completed seal served both an administrative function, its impression pressed into the clay of a sealing that authenticated a document or secured a storage container, and a personal one, the seal worn on a cord or a ring as an object of status whose miniature imagery announced the identity and affiliation of its owner to others who could read that visual language. Kamara's ware, the distinctive polychrome pottery produced at palace workshops on Crete in the period of the Middle Minoan palaces and continuing into the early New Palace period, was among the most technically sophisticated ceramic traditions of the second millennium before the Common Era in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean world. The vessels were thrown on a fast wheel-to-wall thicknesses of only a few millimeters in the most refined examples, the clay carefully levigated to remove coarse inclusions that would cause tearing at such thinness, the forms including tall-footed cups, rounded jugs, and small amphorae, their surfaces burnished before firing to a dense dark ground that received the painted decoration applied before the second firing. The painted patterns, in cream and orange and red applied over the dark ground, combined geometric motifs, spirals, and interlocking curves and bands, with naturalistic forms, plant tendrils and flower heads, and occasionally animals, the combination producing a visual character immediately distinguishable from the pottery traditions of Egypt, the Levant, or mainland Greece. Kamara's ware vessels have been found at Egyptian sites including Lahun and Kahun in the Fayum, at Levantine coastal sites, and in the Aegean Islands, their presence at these locations documenting the reach of Minoan maritime trade in the period when the palace system was at its most economically active, and the number of intact or restorable vessels found at these external sites is sufficient to confirm that the pottery was arriving in quantity rather than as occasional gifts or personal possessions of individual travelers. The distribution of Kamara's ware at these external sites confirms that fine Minoan pottery was not merely a container for the agricultural goods, oil or wine or perfumed substances that it might have carried on its voyage from Crete. The pottery was itself a traded commodity, recognized and valued for its visual character across a wide exchange network. The vessels purchased or exchanged as objects of aesthetic and social distinction, rather than simply as packaging. Later marine-style pottery, produced at Knossos and at other palatial workshops in the period around 1500 before the Common Era, continued the tradition of technically refined export ware with a different visual program. The surfaces painted with octopuses, nautilus shells, sea anemones, and other marine creatures rendered in fluid naturalistic brushwork against a pale ground. The forms of the sea creatures following the contours of the vessel in a way that made the pot itself appear inhabited by its decoration rather than merely covered by it. The marine iconography of this later style was shared with the fresco tradition of the palaces, the same octopuses and sea creatures that appeared on the walls of the domestic quarter, appearing also on the surfaces of the exported pottery. The visual language of the palatial elite circulating through the exchange network both as painted plaster fixed to the walls of the palace and as fired clay moving across the water routes of the eastern Mediterranean. The connection between Knossos and Egypt was maintained across several centuries of the second millennium before the Common Era, documented in both material remains and in pictorial records that survive in the tombs of Egyptian officials who had the contact with the palace's exchange partners that their positions required. Egyptian New Kingdom tomb paintings from the mid-second millennium, in the tombs of officials at Thebes and elsewhere, depict groups of figures identified by accompanying inscriptions as Keftiu, the Egyptian name for the people and products of Crete, carrying objects in the procession scenes that record the arrival of exotic goods at the tomb owner's household. The objects shown in the Keftiu scenes include vessels of distinctly Minoan form, bullhead rhyta and rounded jugs and handled amphora, as well as ingots of copper and objects that cannot be identified with surviving Minoan products, but are being visually distinguished from Egyptian goods in the painting's consistent visual vocabulary, indicating that the Egyptian artists and their patrons recognized a Minoan material category even when individual objects within it were not familiar types. Minoan pottery has been excavated at Egyptian sites, including Avaris, and at sites in the Fayum, and at Tel El Amarna, the short-lived capital built by the pharaoh Akhenaten in the 14th century before the Common Era. Fragments of Aegean-style painted plaster and Minoan-type objects were found in the excavation deposits, extending the evidence of the connection into the later Bronze Age. Cyprus supplied the copper that the palace economy consumed in the largest quantities, the metal arriving in the distinctive rectangular form of the oxhide ingot, the flat slabs with rounded projecting corners at each end, whose shape was determined by the requirements of ship stowage and human portage, rather than by any functional consideration of how the metal would be worked. Each ingot weighed approximately 29 kilograms, and the hoards and cache deposits of oxhide ingots found at Minoan sites across Crete indicate that the copper arrived in bulk consignments and was stored in the palace before being issued to the smiths, who alloyed it with tin to produce the bronze for tools and vessels. The tin component, alloyed at approximately 10% of the total to produce a workable bronze, came from more distant sources whose precise identification for Minoan bronzes remains a matter of continuing isotopic research. Within the Aegean, the distribution of Minoan pottery and Minoan-style objects extended across the Cycladic islands and onto the Greek mainland, with the buried town of Akrotiri on Thera preserving a townscape with frescoes and architectural forms of recognizably Minoan character beneath the volcanic deposits of the island's eruption, and with Minoan objects, bronze vessels, and carved ivory and inlaid weapons appearing in the shaft graves at Mycenae, alongside locally produced gold vessels and weapons in the 16th century before the Common Era. The residential areas of the palace, which Arthur Evans named the domestic quarter, lay on the east side of the central court, and were reached by descending the grand staircase from the court level down into the hillside, so that what appeared from the court as a one-story structure was on its eastern face a four-story building. The lower levels entered directly from the lower terraces of the hill. In the late afternoon and early evening, when the administrative work in the West Wing was concluded and the storerooms were closed and sealed, the activity of the palace shifted to the domestic quarter, to the rooms that Evans identified as the principal residential areas and that had the most elaborate painted decoration, the most refined architectural detailing, and the drainage connections that indicated sustained habitation rather than occasional use. The Hall of the Double Axes, the largest room of the domestic quarter, was designed with a series of doorways controlled by wooden panels running in pairs of parallel grooves cut into the stone thresholds, the panels capable of being slid open fully to make the room a large hall connected to the adjacent light well and the colonnaded terrace beyond it, or partially closed to divide the space into a series of smaller rooms. The flexibility of the arrangement, allowing the space to serve different functions according to the time of day, the season, the number of people present, and the nature of the occasion, a spatial adaptability that the fixed walls of the West Wing storage rooms did not permit. Beyond a right-angle corridor from the Hall of the Double Axes lay the smaller room Evans called the Queen's Megaron, its walls decorated with the dolphin fresco, the creatures rendered in blue-green brushwork against a pale ground, their forms moving across the plaster in naturalistic arcs that conveyed the buoyancy of animals suspended in water rather than the static heraldic arrangements of earlier palatial art. The frescoed walls transforming the room into a space that brought the coastal marine world into the deep interior of a hilltop building. The bathroom of the domestic quarter held a terracotta bathing tub, a deep oval vessel of the type found in other Minoan elite contexts across Crete, set into a paved floor with a drain channel at its edge. Water was carried to the tub from the palace water supply, and the tub was filled and emptied by hand, the process requiring the assistance of workers whose labor was part of the domestic service that the palace administration organized and recorded. Adjacent to the bathroom was the toilet, a seat-height slab over a drainage channel that connected directly to the main terracotta pipe system of the palace. The waste carried through the pipe runs in the floors and walls of the domestic quarter through the eastern hillside and discharged into the Keratos below. In the kitchen and service areas of the East Wing, distinct from the formal administrative storage of the West Wing, the food preparation debris of the evening meals accumulated. The coarse-walled cooking pots with their fire-blackened exteriors, the bones of cattle and sheep and pig, the shells of the murex and the limpet, and the large oyster of the north coast waters, the fish bones of species from the nearshore Aegean, the crushed olive pits from the oil pressing, the grape pips from the wine production, the whole accumulation of a palace table in the second millennium before the Common Era, that the excavation deposits preserved in sufficient quantity for the food, remains specialists of Evans's own era and of subsequent research programs to reconstruct the diet and the supply system that sustained it through the seasons of the palace's occupation. Lustral basins, the sunken rectangular chambers, reached by short flights of steps and found in several locations within the palace complex, were among the most consistent architectural elements of the Minoan palatial tradition, appearing at Knossos and at the other palace centers of Phaistos, Mallia, and Zakros in comparable positions relative to the overall plan. At Knossos, the lustral basin adjacent to the throne room descended perhaps a meter below the main floor level, through a threshold framed in stone. The chamber itself plastered smooth on floor and walls, with no drain connection and no evidence of a water supply, its proportions too small and its position too formal for the kind of practical bathing that the terracotta tub in the domestic quarter served. The absence of drainage in the lustral basins, combined with their consistent placement near pillar crypts and near the most formal ceremonial spaces of the palace, suggested to Evans and to later interpreters that the activity they housed was purificatory in a ritual rather than a hygienic sense, the descent into the sunken chamber and the ascent from it marking a transition in the status of the person who performed it, a crossing of a threshold between the ordinary activities of the palace and the more restricted activities of the ceremonial spaces adjacent. Pillar crypts, low-ceilinged rooms whose central square pillars carried incised labrys marks, the double-headed axe symbol that was the most persistent sacred sign of the Minoan tradition, appeared in the west wing of Knossos and in comparable positions at other palace sites. Their floor deposits, including offering vessels and the residues of activities that did not leave readable texts, but that left the physical marks of repeated use. The labrys appeared not only on pillars, but as a freestanding offering object in bronze and stone at peak sanctuary sites on the hilltops above Minoan settlements, and as a repeated motif in the painted and carved decoration of the palace. Its omnipresence across sacred contexts of different kinds, indicating that the symbol carried a consistent significance across the range of Minoan sacred practice, rather than belonging to a single architectural or functional category. Peak sanctuaries occupied prominent hilltops across Crete, commanding views of the surrounding landscape and the sea approaches, their deposits accumulating in layers of ash and clay and terracotta figurines over the centuries of their use. The figurines representing human forms and animal forms, the humans sometimes shown in postures of devotion or supplication, and the whole deposit representing many generations of activity at an open-air sacred location that required no formal architectural enclosure. The throne room at the south end of the west wing, entered from the central court through an anteroom, contained the gypsum throne still in situ against the north wall, flanked by the painted griffin frescoes whose plaster fragments Evans found collapsed on the floor beside it. The throne sized and shaped for a human body, its seat surface showing the marks of use. The room around it furnished with low benches along the walls and opening immediately to the adjacent lustral basin, so that the arrangement of throne and basin and benches described a room designed for a small group of people in a specific formal relationship to one seated figure in a specific architectural sequence. The agricultural calendar around Knossos was organized by three main crops, and the sequence of their harvests structured the movement of goods through the palace economy across the year, so that the storerooms and the administrative tablets reflected not just a static inventory of accumulated wealth, but the rhythm of production and consumption that the Cretan growing seasons imposed on the entire system. The grain harvest came first, in the late spring and early summer, when the emmer wheat and the hulled barley that grew in the valley fields had ripened after the spring rains, and before the full heat of the Cretan summer settled over the plain, and the work of harvest was intense and concentrated, the stalks cut with bronze sickles and bound into sheaves and carried to the threshing floors on the windward hilltops, where the chaff could be blown clear by the prevailing afternoon breeze. The grain winnowed and cleaned, and then carried in sacks on the backs of pack animals down to the palace magazines and to the village storage facilities across the Knossos plain. The linear A and B tablet records that accumulated in the palace administrative areas documented the distribution of this grain in careful detail, the ration allocations varying by personnel category in ways that indicate a maintained hierarchy of entitlement. Senior officials received larger allocations than craft workers, and craft workers received larger allocations than the class of laborers whose work was organized and supervised by the palace administration and who appear in the tablets as recipients of the minimum subsistence ration. The grape harvest followed in late summer, when the clusters had ripened through the August heat on the terraced hillsides and the bush-trained vines of the slopes east of the Kairos, and the work of gathering was followed by the pressing, the grapes trodden on stone floors with drainage channels that ran the juice into collecting vats below. The must fermented in large clay vessels that were sealed with clay stoppers when the fermentation had progressed sufficiently, and stored in the cool interior spaces of the wine cellars before being transported in sealed amphorae to the palace storerooms or to the harbor for export. The olive harvest came last, extending from autumn into early winter. The work of gathering the fallen and hand-picked fruit spread over several weeks across the groves on the lower slopes of the hill and the flat land of the plain. The olives pressed in stone installations with beam press mechanisms at several points in the agricultural hinterland, rather than centralized at the palace itself. The pressed oil clarified by settling, and then poured through wide-mouthed funnels into the pithoi of the West Wing magazines, where it could be stored for a year or more without significant deterioration. The convergence of the agricultural and maritime seasons was not accidental. The olive oil and the sealed wine amphorae were ready for loading in the autumn months, just as the summer sailing season was drawing to its end, and the last convoys of the year were making their return passages to Egypt and Cyprus and the Aegean ports. The agricultural cycle and the trade cycle interlocked in a way that the palace administration managed and recorded with the same careful attention that it gave to the internal flows of goods through the magazine system. Around 1450, before the Common Era, the major Minoan palace centers across Crete showed destruction horizons in the archaeological record. The traces of events that ended the New Palace period at most sites simultaneously or within a short interval of time. At Zakros on the east coast, at Mallia in the north, at Phaistos and Hagia Triada in the south, and at the smaller palatial centers distributed across the island, burned layers, collapsed roofing material, and broken storage vessels marked the level where the New Palace occupation ended and where subsequent rebuilding in a comparable form did not occur. The sites either abandoned entirely or reduced to smaller settlements without the storage and administrative infrastructure of the palatial system. At Knossos alone, among the major palace centers, occupation continued after this horizon, and the building remained in use, but the character of that occupation had changed in one immediately legible way that the tablet records of the final phase preserve with complete clarity. The script used to write the administrative tablets of the earlier New Palace period at Knossos had been Linear A, the undeciphered syllabic writing system of the Minoan tradition, a script that appears at Knossos and at the other palatial centers and at smaller administrative sites across Crete throughout the New Palace period. The tablets from the final phase of the palace at Knossos, the archive recovered by Evans from the administrative areas near the West magazines and from the domestic quarter, were written in a different script. Linear B, a syllabic writing system that Michael Ventris demonstrated in 1952, recorded an early form of the Greek language, a script used at Mycenae and Tiryns and Pylos on the Greek mainland and at no other Cretan site in the Bronze Age record. The transition from Linear A to Linear B at Knossos was not a gradual evolution of one writing system into another through a period of experimentation and mixing. It was a substitution. the older script disappearing from the site entirely, while the palace fabric and the administrative structure it housed remained largely continuous. The same storerooms and the same categories of commodity now administered in a different language by a different administrative tradition. The Mycenaean period palace at Knossos continued to operate for perhaps another century after the 1450 horizon, the linear B tablets accumulating in the administrative areas and recording a continuing system of considerable scope, tracking thousands of sheep and substantial quantities of grain and oil across a hinterland that still reached from the Knossos plain into the upland pastures. The final abandonment of the palace around 1375 before the Common Era came without the same dramatic physical event that had marked the 1450 horizon. The building not destroyed in a conflagration but emptied over time, the process of its becoming a ruin, gradual rather than sudden. The clay tablets of the earlier destruction baked hard by the fire that had consumed the timber framing and preserved in the excavation deposits of the third millennium of the Common Era, their sign forms as legible when Evans's workmen uncovered them in 1900, as on the day the stylus last moved across their surfaces. The road from Heraklion reaches the site of Knossos after passing through a suburban landscape of modern construction that gives way, as it approaches the boundary of the protected archaeological area, to an older character. Olive trees on either side of the road, the limestone of the hill visible above, the tourist buses pulling off onto the verge in the morning hours. The site entrance opens onto the west court, the paved open area south and west of the palace that was in the Bronze Age, the point where the causeways from the surrounding settlement converged on the hill, and where Evans's concrete reconstructions begin to assert themselves, the column stumps of reinforced concrete marking the positions of the timber originals in a material that has itself aged for a century and acquired a kind of archaeological patina. Arthur Evans began excavating Knossos in 1900, having purchased the site from the Ottoman authorities after a decade of negotiation, and he worked with resources and at a pace that were unusual for the archaeology of his era, employing large teams of local workers and moving through the deposits with a speed that produced results quickly, and that also meant that many of the contextual details of the excavation were recorded less precisely than the standards of later archaeological practice would require. Evans felt the urgency of preservation. What the excavation was uncovering in the stone and plaster fabric of the palace was so fragile in the open air that he judged it necessary to reconstruct collapsed elements in reinforced concrete and to paint surfaces in colors derived from the fresco evidence, rather than to leave the material exposed and unprotected. The reconstructions Evans commissioned, the concrete upper stories of the west wing and the north entrance, the painted column shafts, and the replica frescoes installed in Evans's interpretive positions, have been the subject of sustained archaeological criticism since the mid-20th century, because the concrete additions have in many places made it difficult to study the underlying Bronze Age fabric without first removing 20th century interventions. And because the interpretive decisions embedded in the reconstruction, the choice of which fresco went where, the height of the reconstructed walls, the form of the roof, are not always derivable from the surviving physical evidence with the confidence that the finished reconstruction suggests. The genuine Bronze Age fabric at Knossos, beneath and beside the reconstructions, is extensive and authentic. The stone pavements of the central court and the west magazine floors survive in large sections. The gypsum orthostats of the throne room antechamber stand as Evans found them. The terracotta drainage pipes of the domestic quarter remain in position in their clay bedding, and the threshold stones of the polythyron openings in the hall of the double axes carry the pivot grooves of the original door panels worn smooth by the rotation of the wooden posts that served them across the decades of the palace's use. The Linear B tablets from Knossos, now in the Heraklion Archaeological Museum, were among the first to be deciphered by Michael Ventris, working in the early 1950s from structural analysis of the sign patterns, and the reading of Knossos Linear B as early Greek was confirmed when comparable tablets from the mainland site of Pylos were deciphered in the same system. The convergence of the two archives demonstrating that the script represented a genuine language rather than an administrative notation system. At dusk, when the last visitors have left and the site gates have been locked, the hill of Kafala returns to something approaching its own proportions, the concrete of Evans's reconstructions taking the last light in the same pale tones as the limestone below it, the central court empty, its stone paving still warm from the day, the long north-south axis pointing toward the coast that is no longer visible in the fading light. The Kairos runs below the eastern slope, audible from the lower terraces in the quiet that follows the closing of the site. The stones remain,